Teresa? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the opening of the sixth edition of Poetry Festival Singapore with the theme Legacies and Creation. My name is Azza Ibrahim, your host this evening. Allow me first to welcome our guest of honor for this event, NMP Muhammad Irshad. Good evening, sir. Good evening also to Emeritus Professor Edwin Tambu, fellow directors, poets, artists, and friends. The Poetry Festival, PFS, is a society that promotes poetry in Singapore's four official languages: Malay, Mandarin, Tamil, and English. 2020 is indeed a remarkable year of the new normal, in which can be blessings too. It is also a time of the new creative. As such, we bring to you a debut of our e-poetry festival. And through the dedication and support of our poets and literary community and enthusiasts, we are able to be here this evening in person or at the comfort of your home watching us live. For your information, we are in this charming living room at the Art House, Old Parliament, Singapore. For those watching us from home, you may also want to check the series of events that we have planned between this evening until 30th August. To start this evening opening ceremony, let's have Michelle Low, one of our vice directors, to deliver an opening remark. Michelle?
Hi. Good evening, everyone. I am very happy to be here. And good evening, NMP Mr. Muhammad Arshad, Emeritus Professor Edwin Tambu, Mr. Richard Barangarten, founder of Cambridge Poetry Festival, everyone here in person, and all of you watching from home. Welcome to Poetry Festival Singapore 2020. It has been a very rough year for the arts, and also for us. All events were cancelled until recently because of COVID-19. We are very grateful for the Arts House for having us here today. During the circuit breaker, I wrote this following statement for an upcoming book about the arts and audiences. The editors wanted to capture the impact of COVID-19 in the arts and collected various thoughts of contributors around the world. I shall read an excerpt of my contribution, which was written earlier in May this year, when Singapore was in the extension period of the circuit breaker with tightened measures. And I begin. Should Poetry Festival Singapore be postponed this year? Our team, the PFS team, considered logistical efforts of producing an e-festival. We also considered the online agility of poetry audiences, particularly poetry audiences from Singapore. The team decided that the shift from a physical festival to an online platform would be a rather reasonable one. Why is that? Now, even as I write this in May, Eric, our president, Sharon, our manager, and the entire PFS team were frantically redoing our grant proposals, searching for suitable venues, and then learning all the technological tools of moving a festival online. Under normal circumstances, who would have known that this year's festival would depend on things that we have always taken for granted, such as the resolution of online streaming or the power and the strength of Wi-Fi connection. But PFS team learns to be resilient, and we stand by our art. If this is a period of renewing and starting afresh, let it be that we continue with our tasks with renewed diligence and refreshed energies. If poetry audiences are waiting to go online, whether they are from Singapore or around the world, It is our job then to reach out to them and invite them to join Poetry Festival Singapore 2020. Now back to you, our audiences. Poetry Festival is truly unique. You, our audiences, are multicultural, multilingual, multidisciplinary. Everyone speaks at least two languages, and we grow up in a multicultural, multiracial society. This year's festival theme is Legacies and Creation. We hope to showcase the legacies of Singapore's poetry in Malay, English, Mandarin, and Tamil. One highlight this year is a special interpretation on Prof. Edwin Tambu's poetry, conveyed through the medium of Indian dance. This is coming up very soon. Other highlights include Seminar Legasi dan Penciptaan, a showcase of Singapore's Malay poetry through discussion and spoken word performances moderated by Sazali Sari. Chinese Keynote by Lin Gao and Dr. Tan Chile will be talking about poetry in the age of pandemic in Mandarin. Catharsis will introduce new poets to create new stories in verse. And D.B. Aranya, a teacher poet who will be conducting a workshop to explore the art of poetry writing in Tamil. Multiverse is a poetry workshop in all of Singapore's languages. All these and many, many more other events are happening online from today to Sunday, 30th of August, and most events are free. You can get the tickets from the PFS PTix and our Facebook link. And at PSF, we hope to promote new creations to contribute to our multicultural heritage. We hope to co-create this heritage with you, our audiences, so that we can all be a part of this inheritance and pass on to the later years. With that, welcome to the 6th edition of Poetry Festival Singapore.
Thank you, Michelle. Well, ladies and gentlemen, now it's my honor to invite our GOH NMP Muhammad Irshad to give the opening speech for this festival. Mr. Irshad, please.
Thank you. I think you can hear me. It gives me great pleasure to be present here, and I'm deeply humbled to be invited as a guest of honor to the opening of the 6th Poetry Festival Singapore. My sincere appreciation to the organizers, especially Brother Eric Tinse Wells, and my dear friends Waikid and Irshad Muhammad, who has been instrumental in making sure the communication correspondence is going well. Particularly, I would like to acknowledge the presence of some of our distinguished guests here today. Culture Medallion winner Emeritus Professor Edwin Tembu, award-winning poets and academics Dr. Tan Chi Le and Dr. Azhar Ibrahim, and the critically acclaimed poet and journalist Ms. K. Kanagalata. Unlike the past years, as what Michelle said, this year has been unprecedented at many levels. And despite all the setbacks and unrealized potential of 2020, I'm very heartened that the Poetry Festival Singapore is taking place as planned in spite of the circumstances. And I applaud the passion and determination of the organizers and all of you attending today's opening, and to thank the National Arts Council and all the supporting partners, NHP, NParks, NLB, Gardens by the Bay, LaSalle, NUS, FASS, for the enduring support for this wonderful initiative. And what's really heartening is the fact that your emphasis and focus on having poetry appreciation across all the different religions, Singapore being a multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic society, I think that's very important. And that seems to be the core of the work that they're doing at Poetry Festival Singapore. And in view of the new realities that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought on, I understand that this year the festival also provides a digital platform for poets and readers to imagine a new world through language. And by virtue of it being digital, it's virtually global. And isn't it quite amazing that for the first time you can watch the live stream and broadcast on the PFS Facebook page and YouTube channel? And this year's festival is aptly centered around the theme of legacies and creations, especially in times of COVID-19. And despite the way that the lives and legacies of famous people grab our attention, every single one of us leaves a legacy. And we influence people every day by what we say and what we do, and what we write, create, and share. And all of that influence adds up. As we create our future together, may we use the power of our lives for the good of those whom we touch, from our own families to communities, and even our online connections. And as the great poet Rumi said, when you do things from your soul, you feel a river moving in you, a joy. I was exposed to poetry in my secondary school days when I had to take literature. Obviously, we had to take literature in secondary school. And for some strange reason, I kept doing better in literature than in English. But my love for poetry, in fact, blossomed when I was in my national service. During my national service, I was introduced to Sufi poetry. I was doing my national service in the Singapore Police Force. I had a lot of time, and I used to read. And it was one of those best things that happened, to be honest. And as I started reading more and more poetry books, the likes of the Matnavi by Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, the Gulistan and Bostan by Saadi of Shirazi, and the Conference of the Bird by Faradin Atta, to name a few, I realized that there's a world beyond what I have been exposed to. And it's a world that's filled with possibilities and imagination. And I saw a future in expanding my horizon. And I was today asked to share a poem that I felt resonated with me, that I loved, and allow me to conclude my speech and sharing with a beautiful advice by Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti, a great Sufi saint from Ajmer, India. And in the final discourse to his students, 1 month before his death, he mentioned this poem. And he said, "Love all and hate none. Mere talk of peace will avail you not. Mere talk of God and religion will not take you far. Bring out the latent powers of your being and reveal the full magnificence of your immortal self. Be overflowing with peace and joy and scatter them wherever you are and wherever you go. Be a blazing truth of fire. Be a blazing fire of truth. Be a beauteous blossom of love and be a soothing balm of peace. With your spiritual light, dispel the darkness of ignorance, dissolve the clouds of discord and war, and spread goodwill, peace, and harmony among the people. Never seek any help or charity or favor from anybody except God. Never go to the court of kings, but never refuse to bless and help the needy and the poor, the widow and the orphan, if they come to your door. This is your mission to serve the people." I came across this poem after I was nominated as a member of parliament, and it really resonated with me personally because of the work that I do with Roses of Peace in spreading peace and harmony in Singapore, and to build a cohesive and resilient nation. And it's important to not leave the vulnerable amongst us. And poetry like this and poems such as the one that I just read really inspires you to give out the best and to make sure that you look out for the people amongst you. And with that, have a wonderful and enlightening festival. Stay safe and stay blessed. And thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Muhammad Irshad. To record our appreciation to user, later there will be a token of appreciation, namely books written by our sub-committee directors, namely Mr. Eric Wallace, Dr. Tan Chile, Ms. Lata, Michelle Loh, and myself. Up next, we have a keynote speech by Mr. Richard Berengarten titled Legacies and Creation in the Age of Pandemic. Allow me to introduce Mr. Richard Berengarten very briefly. He's an international poet who lives in the UK. His most recent book, Changing, is an ambitious composite poem of 450 parts based on ancient Chinese masterpiece, the I Ching. Baringarten has published more than 30 books and received many international awards, and his writing has been translated into over 100 languages. He has inaugurated the Volta project and the Albero project, including a forest of trees, a multilingual celebration of nature. He teaches at Downing College, Cambridge. Let's welcome Mr. Richard Baringarten.
Hello everybody, and a very big welcome to the Singapore Poetry Festival. It's an honour and a privilege for me to deliver this opening address to you, all the more so for the very particular multilingual and multicultural dimensions that the festival incorporates. The presence of poets writing in 4 languages in a single country, Malay, Tamil, Chinese and English, is privileged and very special indeed. This interconnectivity is a model for world poetry in our time, and I might add, completely in harmony with my own poetics. My dear friend, the Mexican poet and Nobel Prize winner Octavio Paz wrote, "For the first time in our history, we are contemporaries of all humanity." Contemporaries of all humanity. This, I suggest, could be a fine motto for your festival, especially this year. In 2020, the theme of the festival is Legacies and Creation in the Age of a Pandemic. And the pandemic is the reason, of course, why I'm delivering this address to you by video link from my home in Cambridge in England. My focus is the role of the poet during a time of pandemic, or, to use an older word, a time of plague. We certainly live in the most extraordinary times. Considering the sudden and radical changes in people's behaviour all over the world, we might well call our times revolutionary. Now, I don't mean revolutionary, of course, in any narrow political sense, but in a much more profound sense, which I leave it to you to interpret. A time of revolution is one of both extreme danger and extraordinary possibilities. What I would like to do here today is to give some suggestions as to how we might interpret our present condition, first, as creatures endowed with sentience and intelligence, that is, as human beings, and second, as poets, novelists, dramatists, filmmakers, musicians, painters, and so on. I place all these words second because it's obvious that our roles must be subservient to the fullest possible realization and recognition of our human condition. For being human doesn't simply mean being lords of creation in some arrogant, controlling, dictatorial sense. We can't dictate to nature, and that's something we've realized very recently. Indeed, we're a very small part of nature, and as humans, we have responsibilities to nature. So, what is the role of poetry or other creative writing in the age of a pandemic? My answer is that the role of poetry, as of all the arts and all the sciences, needs to be identical to and informed by the role of humanity itself. The poet's work, and by work I mean both labour, effort and application, and the product of labour, is a small part of the much larger human work. What does this involve? 2 expressions, I suggest, give us clues: caring and taking care. Let's take a look at these. First, by caring, I mean sympathy, empathy, fellow feeling, decency. To quote the Nobel Prize winner Albert Camus in his extraordinary cameo novel The Plague, first published in Paris in 1947, quote, "The only means of fighting a plague is common decency." And another quote later in the book, "After a short silence, the doctor raised himself a little in his chair and asked if Tarrou had an idea of the path to follow for attaining peace. 'Yes,' replied Tarrou, 'the path of sympathy.'" Common decency, then, and the path of sympathy are what I think are first needed in dealing with COVID-19. Now, as an aside here, for all of this book's striking conviction and verisimilitude, we should also note that Albert Camus' novel was written first and foremost as an allegory. The French word in Camus' title, peste, meaning plague, pest, stands for the alien occupation of France by the Nazis in 1940. So to apply this insight to our own times, an enemy occupation is a kind of plague, and a plague is a kind of enemy occupation. As it is, both the literal and the allegorical interpretation of Camus' book ensure that we can learn a great deal from it that helps us to understand COVID-19, as I have found by reading it again in the last 3 months. Similarly, the English writer Daniel Defoe, who is most famous, of course, for Robinson Crusoe, in another extraordinarily pioneering realistic novel entitled A Journey of the Plague Year, which he published in 1722, also emphasizes sympathy. Here's one of the fictional anecdotes his narrator recounts on hearing the story of a poor, honest man trying to make do and feed his family by hard and difficult work in a time of plague. Quote, "As I could not refrain contributing tears to this man's story, so neither could I refrain my charity for his assistance. So I called him. 'Friend,' said I, 'come hither, or I believe thou art in health,'" meaning it was safe to come close because the narrator believed this man to be non-infectious. Quote, "So I pulled out my hand, which was in my pocket before. 'Here,' says I, 'go and call thy wife once more, and give her a little more comfort from me. God will never forsake a family that trust in him as thou dost.' So I gave him 4 other shillings, and bade him go call his wife." Now, what Camus calls sympathy then, and the kind of common decency that Defoe instances here, are what's required in both theory and practice in a time of plague or pandemic. But clearly that's not all. Earlier I mentioned both caring and taking care. Now let's explore the second expression. By taking care, I mean on the one hand taking care of oneself and others, caring for oneself and others, looking after oneself and others. I also mean being careful, being aware, being wary, and above all being self-aware, being responsible and resourceful, being sensible and sensitive, and taking sensible and recommended decisions and precautions in all our actions. All this is very, very difficult to put into practice. The practice is both individual and social, and we might call the qualities required Confucian. Taking care begins at home. It means me telling the truth to myself, telling truth to power, and myself practicing what I preach. It means personal action that's motivated by thought and thoughtfulness, planning, preparation, and feeling and behaving in a connected, conscious way, not just according to spontaneous or impromptu reactions based on feelings and emotions. Again, Camus is clear on this point in a quiet tone that combines cool criticism and caring compassion. Quote, "There can be no true goodness nor true love without the utmost clear-sightedness." I repeat, the utmost clear-sightedness, vigilance, keeping awake and alert, taking care, taking constant care. Next, I've been asked to respond to two specific questions. The first is, what is the role of poetry during a time of disease and death? This profoundly philosophical formulation echoes the even more famous question posed by the German poet Friedrich Hölderlin, who lived from 1770 to 1843, in his elegy Brot und Wein, Bread and Wine. Und wozu Dichter in dürftiger Zeit? He asks. This line has been variously translated into English. And what are poets for in a destitute time? And what are poets for when times are hard? Who wants poets at all in a lean time or in lean years? However it's translated, clearly Hölderlin's question underpins and informs the one posed to us today by our festival organizers. What is the role of poetry during a time of disease and death? Well, here's my short answer. Since our lives are limited in space and curtailed by time, since we're all mortal, since the individual destiny of every one of us is to die, every age, every time, and every moment is a time of disease and death. So what COVID-19 does by emphasizing and quickening our vulnerability and increasing our exposure to death, by bringing death ever more immediately, insistently, and consistently to the foreground of our attention, and so by dramatically arousing in us all of the many responses, thoughts, reflections, and emotions that the presence of death will always inevitably inspire in us. What COVID-19 does precisely is to raise our awareness not only of our mortality and those who are closest to us, but of all humanity. For all these reasons, then, during a time of disease and death, the role of poetry and of all of the works of the imagination is no less and no more than what it always is. During a pandemic, the role of poetry is sharpened, clarified, and intensified by immediate events, but not changed either qualitatively or in kind. In the great Taoist poet Tao Yuanming, who lived from 385 to 427 in our era, we can find hundreds of quotations expressing the theme of mortality and the ephemerality of human life. For example, onward, onward, after 100 years, body and name will both be forgotten. To man's being there is certainly an end. And here's another. Alas, men lodge in the body for 100 years and end in the twinkling of an eye. More than 3 centuries later, identical themes recur in all the great poets of the Chinese Tang dynasty, including Du Fu and Wang Wei. Their focus on vulnerability, transience, uncertainty, and mortality and their sublimely attentive and sympathetic expressions of all these universal feelings and experiences account more than partly for our identification with them, and more than partly explain why we love and admire these poets so hugely and unceasingly, and shall continue to do so across hundreds of future generations. Now, as for the English language, the deservedly most famous and poignant lyrical poem in English that addresses mortality during a pestilence is by the Elizabethan poet Thomas Nashe, 1567 to 1601, a contemporary of Shakespeare, who incidentally also mentions plague in several of his plays. Nashe's title is In Time of Plague, and I shall now read part of this extraordinary poem to you. In a time of plague. Adieu, farewell, earth's bliss. This world uncertain is. Fond are life's lustful joys. Death proves them all but toys. None from his darts can fly. I am sick, must die. Lord, have mercy on us. Rich men, trust not in wealth. Gold cannot buy you health. Physic himself must fade. All things to end are made. The plague full swift goes by. I am sick, I must die. Lord, have mercy on us. Beauty is but a flower, which wrinkles will devour. Brightness falls from the air. Queens have died young and fair. Dust hath closed Helen's eye. I am sick, I must die. Lord, have mercy on us. Strength stoops unto the grave. Worms feed on Hector brave. Swords may not fight with fate. Earth still holds ope her gate. Come, come, the bells do cry. I'm sick, I must die. Lord, have mercy on us. Here then, excuse me. Here then is part of an absolutely beautiful, heart-rending expression of our awareness of human fragility, ephemerality, and mortality, all prompted dramatically by the present plague. And here is a poem by Tao Yuanming, one of my favorites by him, which I shall read in English translation, even if it doesn't do full justice to the original Chinese. The theme, of course, is the fundamental universal law that all things change. The days and months are not able to linger. The four seasons press upon one another. A cold wind shakes the withered branches. Fallen leaves cover the long road. My feeble constitution declines with time passing. The black hair on my temples is early white. Now the white sign is set up on my head. The way in front gradually becomes narrow. My home is an inn for a traveller. I am like a guest that must depart. Away, away, where am I going? On the southern mountain is my old home. So ephemerality, lament, elegy, mourning. These prime themes and features of lyric poetry are universal. They belong to all languages, all cultures, and they become particularly poignant and meaningful at a time of pandemic. I think we should remember too that by expressing profound feelings, the beauty and inner truths of pure poetry provide comfort, solace, and even catharsis. Curiously, happiness and sadness, beauty and sorrow lie very close together. All this confirms that the job of poetry is to speak truth, not only from the mind, the brain, but from the heart too. The ancient Chinese word qi expresses this perfectly, meaning heart, mind, and please forgive my poor pronunciation. I'd like to add here that during the pandemic, as a practicing poet, I found some aspects of the enforced circuit breaking or self-isolation actually very helpful. The quietness imposed by these unusual conditions gives me inner space to reflect and meditate more deeply about life and about what's important in life, and to compose new poems out of that inner space. The pandemic then has attuned me to resonances that are in harmony with the spirit of the Tao, the way of ways that is inexpressible. Tao, Ke Tao, Fei Chang Tao. I become increasingly Taoist in sensibility. Now for the second question asked by the festival organizers. To what extent are traditions rediscovered or disrupted with the creation of new works? My answer is, in a time of pandemic, traditions are both rediscovered and disrupted. Both tradition and the disruption of tradition are sharpened, clarified, and intensified by a pandemic. With both come urgency. COVID-19 is precisely such a time of urgency. Now, let's be a little bit more specific. The work of creative artists and writers can often be seen, especially in retrospect, as symptomatic. Great writers and artists come up with statements that we understand to have been prophetic. Some have their fingers on the pulse of their age to such a degree that they encapsulate it and symbolize it. Some creative artists, poets, writers turn out to be visionaries. Some have their pulse on durable, perennial, and perhaps even eternal truths. The task of the poet then is to witness, to act as witness, to bear witness. Now, the depth and range of meanings in these expressions, witness and bear witness, form a huge poetic and philosophical topic, which I can only mention here. May I suggest that this motif, bearing witness, may well be a theme for you to explore in more detail during this festival. A pandemic involves a situation comparable to war, enemy occupation, revolution, regime change, and it contains aspects of all four. Here is Camus again in The Plague. Quote, everybody knows that pestilences have a way of occurring in the world, yet somehow we find it hard to believe in ones that crash down on our heads from a blue sky. There have been as many plagues as wars in history, yet always plagues and wars take people equally by surprise. Now, whether this last statement about surprise is absolutely true, once again, almost uncannily, Camus' understanding more than 70 years ago entirely fits COVID-19 today. Last year, very few of us would have believed it possible for a mortally dangerous disease to swell to such gigantic proportions that if allowed to run its course unchecked, with its exponential and dramatically fast multiplication rate, it might wipe out millions of us. Second, during a time of war, political revolution, and so on, it's well known that the normative laws and conventions of previous peacetime go through a shift that can be as extreme as a 180-degree reversal. At such times, in many and perhaps even all spheres of human life, transformations occur that produce the total opposite of a previous condition in terms of social, political, and behavioral norms. We go through a metamorphosis, which implies mutability quickened exponentially rather than gradual change. The metamorphosis we're witnessing and living through under COVID-19 are sudden transformations, urgent and life-changing. Confronted by COVID-19, the exact equivalent of a war or occupation mentality has developed. But the differences in this case from all previous cases are at least fivefold. Let's look in more depth, although quickly, at this last statement. First, in war and occupation, the enemy classically is another human society, but this war is against a non-human enemy. Interestingly, in European languages, by long established convention, the use of Greek terms such as pandemic rather than shorter, more immediate physical words like plague, pest, and so on, tend to medicalize the disease, by which I mean remove a good deal of its negative emotive force and its religious and mythological connotations of being sent by a god or the gods as a divine punishment. Even so, words always acquire new emotive connotations. On the radio today, as I was cooking in my kitchen, I heard someone say that the word pandemic sounds too close to the word panic to be comfortable. In ancient Greek mythology, panic is related to the wild god Pan. Second point, COVID-19 isn't just an epidemic, it's endemic. That means it's not going to go away entirely any more than influenza is. Even if, as we all hope, whether this year or next year or sometime later, a vaccine is discovered, the effectiveness of an inoculation isn't likely ever to be permanent. It will have to be constantly reviewed and we shall need to be re-inoculated. So a continuous condition of at least partial war is going to be the norm. Third, this pandemic really does mean universal war, universal invasion, universal occupation. It involves every country in the world. Potentially the entire human race has been or soon will be affected by the COVID crisis, and no group is likely to be excluded. We already know that the virus is causing untold horrors among the indigenous peoples in Amazonia, in Brazil. This extensiveness and all-inclusiveness wasn't true even of the First and Second World Wars, nor has this extensiveness been the case for any previous pandemic. COVID-19 includes the whole of humanity. What's more, we don't yet know the effects of the virus on other animals. This is a huge question, and perhaps one that you might think of exploring in coming discussions. Next point is that our enemy, our common enemy, the COVID virus, depends on us for existence. The virus is parasitic. It can only survive in a host. It needs us for its survival. It's not to the virus's advantage to wipe us all out. So does this perhaps suggest that unlike a global nuclear war, COVID-19 won't wipe out the entire human race, even if, and we hope this doesn't happen, but even if it does wipe out millions? Fifth point about war, we do have weapons. Think, for example, of our understanding of vaccines, of epidemiology, of all aspects and applications of medicine and information technologies, how we can deploy statistics to anticipate hypothetical scenarios, and so on. Even if these are imperfect, all these approaches are being marshaled and coordinated and continuously being tested, retested, and developed. Another point, a common enemy. In war, the struggles and disagreements and so on that are part and parcel of life in peacetime are quickly and radically reorganized to face a common enemy. People form groups which were previously thought to be so different and divergent as to be incompatible. People suddenly and unexpectedly find themselves coming together, reaching agreement and formulating, developing and upholding coalitions, alliances and common strategies in the face of a common enemy. But we also know from countless historical examples, as well as from both depth psychology and social psychology, that centripetal and centrifugal tendencies oscillate. That is to say, even before the problem of a common enemy has been solved, whether by victory or accommodation and compromise, human groups that have been allies will inevitably start their internecine squabbling once again. This is a real problem. And finally, I come to a point that I haven't totally made explicit before, which is togetherness. This short address so far has focused, whether explicitly or by implication, on several aspects and functions of poetry and the verbal arts. Speaking from the heart, expressing and communicating deep human emotions, giving comfort and solace, sympathy, enabling catharsis, and documenting, telling the truth, witnessing, bearing witness, providing testaments. In all these respects, the poet's and the novelist's voices are always deeply, uniquely individual. But I'd like to emphasize in closing another aspect of the verbal arts that has been really important in the COVID crisis. That is singing, and in particular, singing together harmoniously. In the very early days of the pandemic, we people who were watching television in England and the United Kingdom were deeply moved by seeing on our TV videos thousands of Italians standing on the balconies of their apartments and together singing some of the most famous and beautiful arias from Italian operas. So, just as I've invoked the unique individual qualities of poems, the Taoist qualities, a uniqueness that perhaps paradoxically attains universality because it is so deeply individual, let me finish by invoking the commonality of choral song, of coming together in song, and of course, of coming together in discussion, as you are doing, as we are all doing at this festival. The choir, I suggest, is a model, a paradigm of what needs to be done universally in this crisis, an attitude of mind and of spirit and of heart. We all need to come together, to work together, to continue to work together in harmony as in a choir. Working together is, of course, a Confucian attitude. So we have a Taoist attitude and a Confucian attitude merging. Finally, here's a short poem of my own about singing together in a slow wave. In a slow wave, like birds chorusing dawn, when members of co-resident species join in one by one to celebrate light's rebirth, humans too come together in singing. Harmonized voices, triggered, modulated, not so much by light, but by friendship, pour, profuse, generous in all directions. For a choir singing lifts listeners, not in that breathtaking yearning for and occasional touching of utmost transcendent beauty that a soloist sometimes achieves, but in a specific sense of pent-up, numinous glory, gradually massing, unfolding, reverberating in solidarity with all things. Well, I wish you all the very best throughout this festival.
Of Poetry Festival will not be complete unless we have a poetry performance segment. We are very delighted today to honor the next segment, in fact, titled A Tribute to Our Pioneer Poet, Edwin Tambu. His reading will be accompanied by a talented classical Indian dancer, Banu Priya. Banu, Prof.
I want to see Brown the hawk, unrelenting, beautiful, death-dealing, break open the unsuspecting sky. I want to hear forked the tongue from the uncoiling body, tracking lusty crickets in the loam. I want to touch blue the haze, dimming Karimon, overreach unknown slopes to possible mysteries. I want to taste sharp the patai, straight from the curling pot to hold the village in my mouth. I want to see these 5 beginnings. I see, I hear. Birds return to favorite trees, chattering about the day's alarm. Speeding cars, boys sporting powerful power catapults with deadly pellets. A tricky, ambushing cat with a taste for feathers. Leaves yellow yesterday are curling brown. Midday heat lingers between blades of grass, tightening stem, branch and root as earth nurtures and crusades herself in thirst, in our chain of life, in our loss of green. A friend, some folks say a rarity, left with 4 and a bit, on the lookout naturally, vigilant but not obsessed. He will be one who won't mislead even himself, who, for good reason, will procure from the heart of silence courage enough to breach a solemn promise, won't render his strength without distress. without reflecting on what means, whose ends. So schooled is he to feel the way. Insouciance most wounds the self. I know them all, know they can meet, be equal, cogitate, break bread, apportion chapatis over fish head curry, dine subtly at short notice on Leong's special cold dish, pickled cabbage, at the Emerald Room amidst the Chinese orchestra, a taped Clary Loon gently moving into El Condor Plaza, released by 50 lively feminist guitars. To the bodied friend, distance hardly counts for time. Falling leaf is metaphor, shafting light unveiling its drift, its testament. Murals in the sky urge majesty. Whatever the odds, surely he'll come. Before then, we rely on him each morning to bring the sun. What language we have, we too keep in certitude in this sacrament. Eyes above a glass of wine, snatches of old songs, a castle remembered in moonlight. The cry of Solomon, that bird hesitating on a branch, or the sad reluctant flames of evening. You must not slide away, not move beyond words, which stay after champaka, rose, rupture, and fall. When the prodigy collapses, when the drop of water breaks upon the stone, across the brown, uncertain dying of leaves, the wind swirls, gathering the talk of flowers. For the future, it's tense, its coming speech. Then, softer and more knowing, it loops again, searching for the story in a dram of silence. Together, they cloak the hills without conspiracy, moving along valley, river, rising slope of trees, dark granite boulders, the mind's insinuations compacted into images, suitable words, those rhythms cruising the air between day and night. When the mist closes the valley's door, when we climb into the moon, when the poem wants to start.
Thank you, Professor Tambu. Thank you, Banu. Thank
Get
you,
up.
everyone here at
Get up.
home. Don't forget to join us this weekend. There's a lineup of events on tomorrow and Sunday. And please join us via Zoom or at the Art House. Yeah? Please check our website, and there are more details on that. Of course, to our sponsors and partners, a very thank you. And of course, enjoy for the next session. And of course, to a good poetic weekend for all of us. Thank you so much.
Can get up now.